The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like machines trying to remember what sound was. Katie Morrison restocked the first aid station at Jacksonville Town Center Mall, her movements precise and economical, the kind of efficiency that came from doing things right the first time because there was no time for a second attempt. Bandage boxes aligned in perfect rows. Thermal blankets folded with hospital corners. Antiseptic wipes in descending size order. Her left leg bore slightly less weight as she shifted positions, a detail so subtle that most people's eyes would skip over it entirely. Most people. She didn't notice Derek Ashford watching from 30 feet away, his neck tightening as he observed the way her hands moved, not like a weekend first aid nurse, but like someone who had performed these rituals 10,000 times under conditions that mattered. The mall hummed with Saturday afternoon traffic. Families clustered near the food court. Teenagers sprawled across benches outside the cinema. The smell of cinnamon rolls mixed with the sharp tang of industrial cleaner that someone had used on the corridor tiles that morning. Katie checked her inventory sheet again, 2:11 p.m. 3 hours until her shift ended. 3 hours of the careful anonymity she had constructed over 18 months, working weekends while the world moved past her in colorful clusters of normalcy. Her right hand absently touched the inside of her jacket where the patch was sewn, faded 75th Ranger Regiment colors, worn threadbare from hands that had held it during nights when sleeping meant remembering. She never displayed it. Never mentioned it. The patch lived in darkness the way she lived in the background of everyone's periphery. Inventory count looks good. Derek Ashford's voice came from directly behind her. Close. Intentionally close. His cologne smelled expensive and chemical, the kind of scent worn by men who needed to announce themselves. Katie turned, her expression neutral. Ashford was a security manager who wore his position like a suit one size too small, constantly adjusting, constantly uncomfortable. His eyes were the color of wet concrete. They narrowed slightly as he studied her inventory sheets. Very detailed work. Very thorough. Just counting supplies? Her voice came out measured. Professional. Deferential. The voice she had learned to use in civilian spaces, where being noticed was a liability. She kept her shoulders slightly rounded, her posture apologetic, her eye contact brief. The persona of someone trying to take up as little space as possible. Nothing unusual this week. Ashford's jaw tightened. He was looking at her incident reports now, scanning them with the intensity of a man searching for inconsistencies. There were none. Katie's reports were flawless, dates precise, times verified, procedures documented with the clarity of someone trained to create a perfect record because people's lives depended on it. That precision was the problem. Ashford's other reports, the ones he filed for the mall's vendor security agreements, had been loose for 18 months. Vague. Approximate. Room for creative interpretation. The kind of documentation that allowed $847 here, $1,200 there to slip through the system without anyone noticing. But if someone like Katie Morrison ever looked closely at his work, if she ever compared timelines or noticed the gaps in his incident coverage, everything would collapse. You have medical training. It wasn't a question. Ashford's eyes moved from her hands back to her face. Beyond the first aid certification. I can tell. Katie's hands had gone still on the bandage box. She forced them to resume movement. I've been certified for a while. You pick things up. Where did you work before the mall? The question hung between them like a held breath. Katie's right eye twitched once, an involuntary response she couldn't suppress. Different places. Nothing relevant. I prefer to keep my work simple now. Ashford studied her for 5 more seconds. Long enough that Katie could feel her pulse in her neck. Long enough that she wondered if he could see through the manufactured meekness to the person underneath. Then he smiled. It was the smile of a man who had just solved an equation. Simple is good. Simple keeps people out of trouble. Wouldn't want you getting involved in things that are above your pay grade, Morrison. Mall incidents are handled by security protocols. Not by nurses. Understand? Yes, sir. Her voice didn't waver. I understand completely. Ashford left, his footsteps echoing against the tile floor in a rhythm like Morse code. Katie exhaled through her nose, a technique she had learned years ago when learning to breathe through pain meant the difference between staying conscious and not. The scar tissue near her spine, the shrapnel that had never been surgically removed because removing it would have caused more damage than leaving it, ached in the mall's aggressive air conditioning. She had been wrong about Ashford being merely incompetent. There was something else in his eyes. Calculation. The look of a man who understood that competence was a threat to whatever he was protecting. The mall's afternoon ambient noise resumed around her. Laughter from teenagers by the cinema. The distant beeping of a register at the nearby pretzel stand. Water fountains gurgling. All of it so aggressively normal, so determinedly peaceful, that Katie felt the contrast-like pressure in her chest. She had chosen this place specifically because nothing happened here. Because the most critical moment of most days was a scraped knee from a child or a minor allergic reaction. Because she could go an entire shift without anyone asking questions about her limp, or the way she flinched at sudden loud noises, or why her hands moved with a precision that transcended normal first aid training. She glanced at her watch again. 2:52 p.m. 2 hours and 58 minutes left. She returned to her inventory, counting gauze pads with the same methodical focus she had once used to organize surgical supplies in field hospitals where the power failed and the lights came from kerosene lamps and the only instruments were what could fit in a canvas bag. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the feeling that had begun to crystallize in her chest the moment Ashford had walked away, the sensation of a door closing on the quiet life she had built. He had recognized something in her. Some marker of competence that didn't belong in a shopping mall first aid station. And Derek Ashford was not the type of man to let a threat to his operation exist long enough to become a real problem. The food court entrance was visible from Katie's station if she angled her head slightly. She could see the fountain there, the one with the mosaic pattern that had never quite been cleaned properly. She could see the families moving past. The teenagers with their phones. The couples holding hands. All of them moving through their Saturday afternoon unaware that the equilibrium of small moments was about to shift. She didn't know it yet, but someone was approaching the mall entrance at that exact moment, someone whose presence would test every single skill she had spent 18 months keeping dormant. Katie Morrison counted the remaining minutes of her anonymity without knowing that she was counting them. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. The mall moved with its Saturday rhythm. And somewhere in the building, Derek Ashford was already making phone calls, already beginning to understand exactly what Katie Morrison represented to his carefully constructed world of embezzled fees and falsified incident reports. He had seen the limp. He had missed the legend. The overhead speaker crackled at 3:15 p.m. Derek Ashford's voice echoed across Jacksonville Town Center, bouncing off tile and glass and the ears of 200 shoppers frozen mid-step. Nurse limp along to the security office. Nurse limp along, security office now. The words hung in the fluorescent air like cigarette smoke. Katie felt every eye track her left leg as she walked past the food court, past families licking ice cream cones, past teenagers recording on their phones. The limp was worse when she knew people were watching. Her ankle had been shattered by shrapnel in Marjah, reconstructed with titanium and prayer. And on days like this, days when the humiliation crawled up her spine like insects, the titanium felt heavier than it should. She didn't rush. That was the thing about having survived 9 hours of Taliban fire with a field hospital and 3 bodies she couldn't save. She didn't rush for Derek Ashford. She didn't rush for anyone. The security office was on the 2nd floor, past the department stores and the pretzel stand that smelled like salt and desperation. Ashford was waiting, leaning against his desk like he owned the building. He probably thought he did. The mall paid him $48,000 a year, and he'd constructed an entire empire of small cruelties on that foundation, a man made of assumptions and resentment, the kind of man who had never been tested and therefore believed himself untestable. Your incident report from last week, he said, tapping a printed page. Too detailed. Too professional. Makes my staff look bad. Katie met his eyes with measured calm. Her hand stayed still. Her breathing stayed even. This was the posture of someone who had learned a long time ago that reaction was a luxury. "I documented what happened," she said. Her voice didn't waver. It never did. Ashford stepped closer, close enough that she smelled the coffee on his breath, the artificial vanilla from whatever cologne he used to make himself matter. "Your first aid. Not ER. Not some," he paused, searching for the word. "Not some battlefield hero. Stop playing hero at my mall." One tear escaped down her cheek. Just one. She didn't blink it away. She wiped it with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact, and when she spoke, her voice came out like frost over steel, like something that had learned to cut through winter. "I've been dismissed by better men than you." The words landed in the space between them like a dropped scalpel. Ashford's face flushed red, a deep wine color that started at his neck and climbed upward. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that. He wasn't used to women who had learned their composure in places where screaming got people killed. "Get out," he said. "Get out of my office." She stood slowly. Before she left, her hand brushed the inside of her jacket, felt the faded 75th Ranger Regiment patch sewn into the lining. It was smaller than a postage stamp, barely visible unless you knew where to look. She'd stitched it there 3 years ago on the night of her discharge, right after the VA doctors said she'd never deploy again, right after the Army classified the field thoracotomy she'd performed with a combat knife under fire as an unauthorized medical procedure. The patch was proof that she'd belonged to something larger than Derek Ashford. It was proof that command authority looked different in her hands than in his. 30 minutes later, she was restocking gauze in the supply closet when Ashford cornered her. He moved fast for a man his size, backing her against the shelves so she couldn't escape without pushing past him. His breath came hot and quick, fueled by anger and something else, desperation, maybe. He'd seen something in her medical competence, something that threatened whatever scheme he was running. Derek Ashford was the type of man who knew he was stealing. He just didn't know how obvious he was about it. "Wannabe hero types don't last long here," he said. His finger jabbed her shoulder with each word, a physical punctuation mark. "You think you're special because you can slap a Band-Aid on a kid's scraped knee? You think that makes you important?" Katie absorbed it with one measured breath. Her hand stayed steady on the supply box. The motion was meditative, the routine so familiar that her mind could watch her body work while her thoughts remained somewhere distant and safe. This was muscle memory, too. Not medical muscle memory, but survival muscle memory. She had learned to absorb blows, verbal, physical, spiritual, without flinching. It was a skill she'd developed over 18 months in Marjah, refined through 3 years of civilian life, perfected right here in a supply closet that smelled like antiseptic and Derek Ashford's fear. "I do my job," she said quietly. "That's all." Ashford stepped back, and she could see him searching for something else to say, something sharper. But he found nothing. He settled for a look that promised this wasn't over. Then he left, the door closing softly behind him. The third humiliation came at 6 o'clock, shift change, when the evening crew gathered in the employee parking lot. The sun was dropping behind the strip mall across the street, painting the asphalt in shades of amber and rust. Ashford's voice crackled over the outdoor speaker system, and Katie realized with a kind of sick clarity that he'd planned this moment. He timed it for maximum audience. "Morrison, you're reassigned. Inventory duty in the parking lot medical van. Effective immediately." He was outside now, standing near the flagpole, handing her a set of keys. His smile was thin and victorious, a wolf showing its teeth. "We need someone with limited mobility for vehicle duty. Stationary position. You understand." 14 co-workers stood frozen. Sarah Chen, the evening nurse who'd covered for Katie twice last month, looked away. Nobody moved. Nobody said anything. In that silence, Katie understood something that hadn't occurred to her before: they were all afraid of him. Not afraid in the way she understood fear. Afraid the way civilians understood fear, which was to say not at all. They hadn't learned fear in a place where the mortar fire didn't stop. They didn't know what it meant to be truly powerless. Katie took the keys. Her face became a mask. But her hand shook for just a moment as she walked to the van, alone, the keys cool and heavy in her palm. The van was a modified Ford Transit, white with red crosses on the side, parked at the far edge of the lot where no one would see it. Inside, there were shelves of medical supplies, oxygen tanks in their racks, a defibrillator mounted on the wall. Inventory duty. It was a form of exile, designed to keep her away from the main first aid station, away from any position where her competence might actually matter. She was cataloguing the oxygen tanks, size D, size E, the portable units with their precise eye measurements, when she heard it. A cluster of sounds. Shouting. The screech of a stroller being abandoned. Someone calling for help. The commotion came from the food court entrance, maybe 200 meters away. Katie's instincts overrode the humiliation. They overrode the pain in her ankle. They overrode the exhaustion that came with being repeatedly dismantled by a man who didn't understand what he was dismantling. She grabbed the emergency kit and moved fast despite the limp, her training flooding back like muscle memory, like something that had been sleeping and was now awake. The young man on the floor was mid-20s, army dress uniform, his skin a gray that had no business being on a human face. His breathing was shallow. Irregular. The kind of breathing that preceded collapse. She dropped to her knees. Her fingers found his pulse, thready, fluttering, dangerous. The crowd pressed close. Someone said 911 was called. Katie was already rolling him to recovery position, her hands moving with the precision of someone who had done this before, in places where there was no ambulance and no backup and only the choice between acting and letting someone die. That's when she saw his face clearly. Lieutenant Jason Morrison. Her son Michael's commanding officer. She'd seen this young officer in photographs, heard his name a dozen times in Michael's deployment updates. But she forced the shock down. Forced her focus to narrow to pupils and pulse and the way his jugular veins were distending in a way that made her stomach tighten. Cardiac tamponade. Probably. What are you doing? Derek Ashford's voice came from behind her. You're off first aid duty. Katie ignored him. She was already checking the lieutenant's airway, already running through the cascade of assessments that only someone trained in emergency medicine could process this fast. He's in cardiac distress, she said. Her voice had changed. It was sharp now. Commanding. The voice of someone giving orders, not asking permission. Ambulance ETA, she called out to the mall cops gathering at the edge of the crowd. One of them checked his radio, and the delay in his voice told her everything. 12 minutes out. 12 minutes. Katie's jaw tightened. The lieutenant's skin was turning darker. The way he was breathing, the way his oxygen saturation was probably cratering right now, he wouldn't make 12 minutes. Fluid was accumulating around his heart. The heart was tamponading. And in 12 minutes, he would die, right here on the tile in front of the Cinnabon and the Orange Julius, while Derek Ashford watched. Ashford leaned close, hissing, "You're creating a scene. Let the paramedics handle it." Katie's hands didn't stop moving. She was already reaching for the stethoscope in her kit, already listening for the muffled heart sounds that would confirm what her instincts were screaming. The invisible line between her carefully rebuilt civilian life and the battlefield surgeon she once was began to blur, then blur again, then disappear entirely. The next words out of her mouth changed everything. The oxygen tanks hummed their mechanical rhythm inside the medical van parked at Jacksonville Town Center's loading dock. Katie Morrison cross-checked inventory against the laminated clipboard for the third time that shift, 12 units full, 6 marked for exchange, 3 backup portable cylinders wedged against the far wall. She moved with the efficiency of someone who'd done this same task 1,000 times before, hands sliding across cold aluminum surfaces, her movements economical and exact. The faded 75th Ranger Regiment patch sewn inside her jacket lining felt heavier than usual, a weight that had nothing to do with fabric. The commotion started small. A distant shout from inside the mall, then a woman's voice calling for help, then the unmistakable sound of panic beginning to multiply. Katie's head lifted. Her jaw tightened. She'd trained herself for 9 years not to respond to sounds like that, to remain in her carefully constructed civilian lane, restocking supplies, asking no questions, accepting every humiliation Derek Ashford could distribute. But her body remembered something her mind had been trying to forget. Her muscles remembered Marjah. She descended the van steps and moved toward the food court entrance with her limp barely noticeable, each step deliberate, controlled. The crowd had already begun gathering in that instinctive swarm pattern humans adopted around crisis. A security guard was calling for a manager. A teenage girl was filming on her phone. And on the linoleum floor near the orange Julia stand, Lieutenant Jason Morrison lay motionless. Katie's breath caught. Not because he was unconscious. Not because he'd collapsed. But because she recognized him immediately. Lieutenant Morrison. 2nd Battalion, her son Michael's commanding officer from Fort Benning. The man who'd sent her son home safe 6 months ago with a handwritten note that read, "Your mother raised you right." He'd been here at the mall, probably meeting family, probably buying something ordinary, when whatever was happening inside his chest decided to happen right now, on this tile floor, in this food court that smelled like grease and terror. "Clear back," Katie said quietly, moving through the crowd with the authority of someone whose voice hadn't asked permission. "Everyone take 3 steps back. Now." People moved. They always did, even when they didn't know why. Lieutenant Morrison's breathing was wrong. Katie dropped to one knee beside him, her eyes cataloguing the landscape of his body like she was reading a map she'd memorized years ago. Skin pale. Lips beginning to turn blue at the edges, cyanosis spreading like ink through water. His chest rose and fell in gasping, irregular patterns. Not the smooth breathing of normal sleep. Not the measured breathing of a man whose heart was pumping blood correctly. 90 seconds. That's what she had. Maybe less. The signs assembled themselves in her mind with the same precision they'd assembled 10,000 times before: lips cyanotic, breathing shallow and rapid, chest rise inadequate, color draining like someone was turning down the saturation on his entire body. His jugular veins were distended, pressed outward like small cords beneath the skin. His breathing was getting worse, not better. Each gasp shallower than the last. Cardiac tamponade. The diagnosis hit her with the weight of a physical blow. Blood or fluid accumulating in the pericardium, the tough membrane surrounding the heart, squeezing the organ from the outside, preventing it from expanding fully, crushing his cardiac output 1 second at a time. She'd seen this exact presentation in field conditions. She'd treated it exactly once in Marjah, in a hospital tent with 4s and proper equipment and 3 soldiers standing watch. She'd saved that patient. She'd also lost 2 others the same night because tamponade moves fast and mercy moves slow. Lieutenant Morrison's blood pressure was dropping. She could see it in his face. His eyes were starting to flutter. His body was beginning that peculiar stillness that came right before the end. Katie made the decision that would split her civilian life clean in half. "I need the camping store," she said, loud enough for the nearest crowd of bystanders to hear. Loud enough for Derek Ashford, who was pushing through the crowd on the far side of the food court, to hear clearly. "2nd level. I need the sharpest pocket knife they have. And I need hand sanitizer. 60 seconds. Move." "What the hell are you?" Ashford started, his voice sharp and authoritative. 30 seconds, Katie interrupted, her hands already finding the insertion point below Lieutenant Morrison's sternum. The xiphoid process. The landmark she needed. Her fingers moved with the certainty of muscle memory 9 years old but absolutely perfect. He's in tamponade. Cardiac arrest is coming. Someone call 911 if you haven't already. Tell them ETA. Ambulance is 12 minutes out, a security guard said, his voice shaking slightly. Maybe 13. 13 minutes. Lieutenant Morrison had maybe 90 seconds before his heart stopped entirely. A teenager, maybe 16, wearing a Hollister t-shirt and an expression of absolute panic, sprinted toward the mall's interior. Katie's hands remained steady. She'd kept them steady while a Taliban sniper put rounds through the hospital tent's canvas walls. She'd kept them steady while holding intestines back inside their cavity. She'd kept them steady for 9 years since then, in a civilian mall, stocking gauze pads and pretending that part of her didn't exist anymore. "You cannot perform surgery." Ashford's voice arrived before his body, face flushed with something that looked like rage but smelled like fear. He understood, on some level, what was about to happen. He understood it would be impossible to spin, to control, to fit neatly into his narrative of Katie Morrison as a limping has-been pretending at competence. "Then he dies," Katie said flatly, looking at Ashford directly for the first time. Her voice had dropped an octave. The deferential nurse from the supply closet and the parking lot van, the one who said sorry and accepted humiliation and touched her hidden patch like it was a lifeline, was gone. "He dies on your floor." His mother gets a call from the Jacksonville police. His commanding officer gets paperwork. And you have to explain why you prevented emergency medical intervention. That acceptable to you? Ashford's mouth opened. Closed. The teenager returned with a camping knife, a serious one, steel blade sharp enough to catch light. His hands were shaking as he handed it to Katie. She'd already unscrewed a bottle of hand sanitizer from the first aid kit in her pocket. The smell hit immediately, that bright, chemical tang that meant military field hospitals and blood and lives hanging in the balance. She poured sanitizer over the blade, watched it run clear, did it twice more. "Someone's filming," she said to the crowd. It wasn't a question. "Keep filming. Document everything." "What's the lieutenant's name?" "Jason Morrison," the teenager whispered. "Is he going to?" "His name's Jason," Katie repeated. "I'm Katie. I'm going to stop his heart from being crushed. This is going to look worse than it is. Don't let anyone move me. Don't let anyone stop me." Her fingers found the angle precisely. Fourth intercostal space. Just below the xiphoid process. The exact location where needle could reach pericardial sac without passing through lung tissue. She'd done this on a mannequin in training. She'd done this once in reality, in a tent that smelled like blood and diesel fuel and human fear. She pressed the needle, attached to an improvised syringe, through skin, through fascia, through the tough membrane of the pericardium itself. The resistance changed as she penetrated each layer. Then, resistance gone. Needle in. Syringe positioned. "Straw-colored fluid," she murmured, more for the phone cameras than for anyone present. The pericardial sac was compressed. The fluid drained in steady, measured draws as she pulled back on the syringe plunger. 20 milliliters. 40. 60. With each milliliter, Lieutenant Morrison's chest expanded slightly. His gasping breathing began to change quality. His color started to return. The cyanosis around his lips faded from blue toward normal. His eyes stopped fluttering. His body stabilized in the way bodies do when the crushing pressure against their heart suddenly releases. Katie withdrew the needle, covered the puncture site with sterile gauze, and placed pressure directly over the xiphoid process. She was still kneeling. She was still steady. She was still the same woman who'd held a field hospital alone for 9 hours under Taliban fire. Behind her, Derek Ashford was on his phone. She could hear his voice, low and furious, his cousin at the licensing board. "Then, get Rodriguez off the first aid station. Move her to parking. Do it now. Then, flag her badge. I don't care if it takes 5 minutes. Disable access remotely. She's performing surgery in my mall. Unauthorized. Endangering patrons. I'm documenting everything." Sirens were approaching. The ambulance, finally. Katie didn't move from Lieutenant Morrison's side. She watched his oxygen saturation, watched his breathing pattern normalize, watched color return to his extremities. His eyes fluttered open. His hand moved. His lips formed a single word, confused, barely audible. Reaper. That was her call sign. From Marjah. From a time when Katie Morrison was Major Morrison, and Majors didn't limp, and Majors saved lives under fire, and Majors received recognition for the lives they saved. Only 3 people in Jacksonville knew that call sign. The sirens got closer. 2 security guards appeared, moving with the formal precision of men executing orders they didn't understand. "Ms. Morrison," one of them said quietly, professionally. "Your badge has been deactivated. You need to come with us." Katie didn't argue. She stood slowly, her hands away from her body, the camping knife already placed in the first aid kit. The paramedics burst through the food court in trance, 2 women and a man, moving with that controlled urgency that meant they knew what to do. Katie stepped back. She gave them report in a voice like frost over steel. Cardiac tamponade. Presented with cyanosis, elevated JVD, muffled heart sounds. Emergency pericardiocentesis performed approximately 2 minutes ago with successful fluid evacuation. Approximately 80 milliliters removed. Patient is currently stable, conscious, responsive. No allergies documented. The lead paramedic, a woman with a lieutenant's patch on her uniform, looked at Katie, then at the lieutenant on the ground, then back at Katie again. Understanding moved across her face. "What's your name?" the paramedic asked. "Katie Morrison," she said. "MA or RN?" "RN," Katie replied. "Former military. 9-year civilian. This is Lieutenant Jason Morrison from Fort Benning." The paramedic nodded. "Nice work," she said simply. "We've got him." The security guards were waiting. Katie walked with them through the food court, past the crowds, past the phones still filming, past Derek Ashford's face, which had gone the color of spoiled milk. She'd saved a lieutenant's life. She'd done exactly what she was trained to do. And she'd shattered the careful architecture of her anonymous civilian existence in 90 seconds. The paramedics loaded Lieutenant Morrison onto the stretcher. The crowd began to disperse slowly, reluctantly, the way crowds did after witnessing something extraordinary. The video files were probably already uploading to the cloud, spreading across social media in the way that videos do when they contain footage of a calm woman performing what looked like surgery with a camping knife on the floor of a shopping mall. The paramedics arrived 7 minutes later. The lead EMT, a grizzled veteran with 30 years of road experience, stepped out of the ambulance and assessed the scene in 3 seconds flat. Crowd. Phones filming. A conscious male patient breathing steadily on the polished tile. Katie knelt beside Lieutenant Morrison, her hand steady as surgical steel, her voice dropping into the clipped precision of someone who'd spent 9 years pretending to be ordinary. "Cardiac tamponade," she said, not to the crowd but to the paramedic. "Pericardial effusion, approximately 60 cubic centimeters. Emergency pericardiocentesis performed at 13:42. Needle decompression, mid-axillary approach. Vital signs stabilizing. No arrhythmia post-procedure. O2 sat 94 and climbing." The paramedic's eyes snapped to hers. "You performed a pericardiocentesis with a pocket knife." Katie nodded once. "Sterilized. Camping store. No other option." He studied her face for 2 full seconds, the kind of assessment that happened between professionals who'd both operated in the margins where protocols became suggestions and improvisation meant the difference between breathing and flatline. Then he nodded back with unmistakable respect. "You just saved this man's life with pocket cutlery. That's not standard." "Nothing about today is standard," Katie said. The paramedics moved with practiced efficiency, their equipment and movements flowing around her like water around stone. They loaded the lieutenant onto the stretcher, his eyes fluttering open now, confusion softening into recognition as consciousness reassembled itself in his brain. His hand reached out. "Where?" he managed, his voice rough as gravel. "The nurse." "Where did she go?" "Right here," Katie said, touching his shoulder once. "You're stable. Your heart's beating strong." You're going to Oak Creek Memorial. Cardiologist will drain any remaining fluid, but you're walking out of this. Lieutenant Morrison's eyes focused on her face. For just a moment, something flickered across his expression, recognition. Not of her face. Of something deeper. Something that reached down through layers of consciousness and pulled up a memory from a place far from Jacksonville, far from shopping malls and flickering fluorescent lights. Reaper, he whispered. Katie's spine went rigid. Not visible, no one watching would have seen the micro-movement of vertebrae locking, the breath caught in a throat that had learned long ago not to give anything away. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The word hung in the recycled air like something toxic, something that had lived buried inside her jacket lining for 9 years and should have stayed there. The paramedics wheeled him toward the ambulance. Katie stood, her hands empty now, her pocket knife already returned to the camping store display rack where it belonged, wiped clean and unmarked. Around her, the crowd dispersed slowly, reluctantly, the way crowds did after witnessing something extraordinary. The video files were probably already uploading to the cloud, spreading across social media in real time. But Derek Ashford was already moving. He emerged from the mall entrance with his phone pressed to his ear, his face a mask of administrative concern. Katie watched him as he gestured toward her, not pointing, that would be too obvious, just a subtle hand movement that said everything. He'd called his cousin on the city licensing board. She knew because she'd heard him mention it once, casually, during a lunch break. A cousin named David who worked in medical board oversight. The kind of cousin you called when you needed official machinery to move in your favor, when you needed paperwork and authority and regulatory force to do the work that physical threats couldn't accomplish. Ashford gestured to the other first aid nurse, Sarah Chen, and reassigned her to the third-floor retail zone in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Sarah's eyes met Katie's for one brief moment, apology, helplessness, the weight of someone watching a trap close and unable to warn the person inside it. Then security approached Katie. Not Derek, that would be too direct. Derek was too smart for that. He'd already arranged it so that the security director, a man named Coleman who owed Ashford favors, did the talking. Coleman's face was apologetic, which somehow made it worse. "We need you to come with us, Ms. Morrison," Coleman said, and it wasn't a request. "It's protocol." Katie followed. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She didn't say that she'd performed pericardiocentesis under Taliban fire with tools less sterile than a camping store pocket knife. She didn't mention the 3 soldiers whose faces visited her at 3 in the morning, the one she couldn't save that night in Marjah when the field hospital took a mortar round and everything went to red chaos. The office was small. Sterile. Derek Ashford sat behind his desk like a judge, and Patricia Vance from HR sat beside him, her expression caught between professional obligation and genuine discomfort. There were 2 witnesses, mall security protocol, they said. Everything documented. "Ms. Morrison," Ashford began, his voice measured and professional, the kind of voice that worked perfectly for recording devices. "You performed an unauthorized medical procedure in a public space. You endangered mall patrons by using non-sterilized instruments. You violated your scope of practice as a first aid station nurse. This constitutes gross misconduct." Patricia Vance slid termination paperwork across the desk. Katie signed without reading it. Her hand didn't shake. The pen moved with the same precision that had guided the pocket knife into Lieutenant Morrison's chest wall, finding the space between ribs, finding the fluid that had been crushing his heart, finding the way to save a life that had somehow already been saved once before by her hands in a place no one here would ever understand. Effective immediately, Ashford continued, "Your employment is terminated. Your access badge is deactivated. You'll return it to HR before you leave the building." Katie nodded. She didn't speak. Speaking meant her voice might change, and her voice was the last armor she had. It had learned to stay flat, to stay small, to not betray the systems underneath. The laundry facility was in the basement, fluorescent lights buzzing like insects trapped in glass. Katie returned her polo shirt, the one with the first aid emblem stitched over the left breast, and folded it with military corners. The creases were perfect. The fabric aligned. She placed each shirt on the counter in a stack of 5, her ID badge on top, cut in half so it couldn't be reassembled, couldn't be used again, couldn't pretend to grant access to someone who no longer belonged anywhere. Gloria, the laundry supervisor, watched silently. She was older, maybe 60, with hands that had seen hard work and brown eyes that missed nothing. "I saw what you did up there," Gloria said quietly. "That boy's alive because of you." Katie nodded once, not trusting her voice, protecting it like an instrument that might shatter if mishandled. She picked up her jacket, the one with the faded 75th Ranger Regiment patch sewn inside the lining, the one that had traveled with her for 9 years through malls and break rooms and a life built entirely on the principle of invisibility, and walked toward the service exit. The Jacksonville heat hit her like a physical thing when she pushed through the doors. The parking lot shimmered. Her car sat where she'd left it, patient and ordinary. Behind her, Derek Ashford watched from his office window on the 4th floor, watching her walk away, satisfied. He didn't see the surveillance tech in the security booth, a hospital IT veteran named Marcus Webb who worked weekends doing side jobs, who'd been monitoring the cameras and had seen everything. Marcus was already uploading files to a secure server. Every frame of Ashford's badge manipulation. Every moment of his phone calls. Every piece of evidence that would matter later, though neither of them knew it yet. Katie's hand was on her car door when the sound cut through the parking lot, tires screeching, multiple vehicles, the kind of organized chaos that only came from serious purpose and serious authority. A black SUV pulled in hard, followed by 2 more vehicles. A man in civilian clothes emerged moving like something built for command, and Katie recognized him instantly. The bearing. The presence that made the air pressure change around him. The 4-star general's insignia visible on the ring on his hand even from 50 feet away. 4-star General James Morrison, Army Rangers. The ambulance doors were still open. Katie could hear the lieutenant's weak voice calling out, searching, the way trauma patients called for the thing that had anchored them to life. The general climbed inside the ambulance and Katie watched through the open doors as the lieutenant's eyes found her across the parking lot. His lips moved. "Where is she?" the lieutenant asked, louder now, his hand lifting, pointing directly at Katie's face. "That's Reaper. She's Reaper." "The nurse, that's Reaper." The general's head snapped around like he'd been struck. He stepped out of the ambulance and his eyes locked on Katie's face. And then Michael emerged from the second vehicle in his army uniform, tears already streaming down his face, his hand reaching out. "Dad," Michael said, his voice breaking like something fragile meeting immovable force. "That's Major Morrison." That's her. That's Major Catherine Morrison from the 75th. The general pulled out his phone with trembling hands. His finger moved across the screen and Katie watched his face shift as he read whatever was there. Personnel files. Medical records. The official history of a woman who wasn't supposed to exist anymore, who'd spent 9 years learning to be invisible, learning to fold into the background of ordinary life. The general looked up at her, and his voice came out like gravel over broken glass, Major Catherine Morrison. 75th Ranger Regiment. A Navy SEAL team leader who'd been shopping with his family approached, his face reverent. He removed his hat, a gesture of respect that made the crowd of onlookers suddenly go still. 3rd Battalion, the SEAL said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who knew exactly what they were looking at. "We studied your Marjah operation at Coronado. Silver Star for the Field Hospital Defense. 2 Bronze Stars with Valor. Purple Heart." Katie's hands hung at her sides. She didn't move. Didn't speak. The afternoon sun beat down on the parking lot and somewhere a car alarm was going off in the distance, steady and insistent. The general walked toward her, and the crowd of shoppers and security and paramedics parted like water. He stopped 3 feet away and rendered a salute so crisp it could cut glass. His hand came up to his forehead, his bearing ramrod straight, his eyes locked on hers. "Major Morrison," he said, his voice shaking with something that might have been emotion or might have been 9 years of command finally meeting someone he'd only ever known through stories. You saved my son's life. Again. That wasn't the worst part. The paramedics were moving fast, loading Lieutenant Morrison onto the gurney with practiced efficiency, oxygen mask already in place, for lines running, the stretcher wheels squeaking against the wet parking lot asphalt. Katie stepped back, giving them space, her job finished, her hand steady at her sides. The lieutenant's eyes flickered open. Unfocused. Searching. Then they found her face through the chaos of bodies and equipment and flashing red ambulance lights. He whispered one word. Just one. Reaper. The name hung in the humid Jacksonville air like a shell casing falling to concrete. Reaper. Her call sign from Marjah. From 9 hours defending a field hospital alone. From nights that had no names because naming them meant living them again. Only 3 people in the continental United States knew that call sign was hers, and one of them was dying on a stretcher. The lieutenant said it again, louder now, his voice cracking with recognition and gratitude and the kind of awe that comes from knowing exactly what someone did when the bullets wouldn't stop. A man appeared at the edge of the parking lot. Not jogging. Running. Full sprint across 70 yards of asphalt, civilian clothes, grey polo shirt, khaki pants, but moving with the controlled fury of someone trained to breach walls and take objectives. He was 62, maybe 63, hair silver and cut high and tight, face like weathered oak, and when his eyes locked on the stretcher, on his son, the world seemed to compress around him. 4-star General Harrison Morrison, United States Army Rangers. He hadn't been briefed. Hadn't been called. Had been sitting in a parking lot 500 yards away at a medical conference, hands folded on the table, listening to a presentation on cardiac protocols when his phone buzzed with a news alert from Jacksonville's local feed, officer down. Medical emergency. Lieutenant Morrison, Jacksonville Town Center. He'd run. No hesitation. No questions. Just the practiced sprint of a father who'd sent his son into combat zones and knew exactly what could happen in a heartbeat. Michael Morrison stepped forward from the crowd of bystanders and first responders, voice cracking like he was 16 again instead of 28, a lieutenant himself now, standing in his dress uniform because he'd been on his way to that same medical conference. Dad. Dad, that's, Michael's voice broke. That's Major Morrison. She's the one who saved your entire battalion. Marjah. She's the one. The general didn't move. Didn't blink. Just stared at Katie with the kind of intensity that could strip paint. Then he pulled his phone from his pocket with a hand that was shaking, actually shaking, and his fingers flew across the screen, searching, accessing, reading, his jaw getting tighter with each word. Her name came up first. Catherine Eleanor Morrison, Major, 75th Ranger Regiment, Medical Operations Specialist. Silver Star Citation. 2 Bronze Stars. Medical discharge, service-connected disability. The general read every word, his eyes moving faster, his breathing deepening, his presence expanding like someone who'd just realized he was standing next to a legend and hadn't known it. Your battalion. His voice was gravel over ice. Tell me exactly what she did. Michael didn't hesitate. The words tumbled out in military precision, Marjah Valley, 2011. Counterinsurgency operation. Taliban overran the medical compound. Mortar fire. Small arms. RPGs. Major Morrison held the hospital alone for 9 hours. Alone, Dad. No backup. No air support available. She performed 17 field procedures with equipment that was half destroyed. She stabilized 84 wounded personnel. She called in her own evacuation under fire. Saved everyone who was savable. The general's hand went to his chest. Not a pain. A reverence. A salute to something he understood in his bones, the kind of courage that doesn't advertise itself. Then another voice cut through the parking lot noise. Clear. Calm. Naval. A Navy SEAL team leader stood 3 feet from the stretcher, service dress uniform, medals across his chest like a constellation, and he removed his cover, his hat, slowly, respectfully, the way you do at a grave. Major Morrison. He spoke clearly enough for everyone in the expanding crowd to hear. I need to name your decorations. For the record. For everyone here. Bronze Star. First deployment, Cuna Province, 2009. Combat Casualty Care Under Fire. Bronze Star. Second deployment, Helmand Province, 2010. Medical Leadership in Hostile Territory. He paused. The crowd went silent. Silver Star. Marjah Valley, 2011. Extraordinary heroism. You held a medical facility alone. You performed surgical procedures without anesthesia supply. You called in your own helicopter extraction under direct fire while carrying wounded personnel. 17 hours of sustained combat operations. 84 lives. That's your Silver Star. The SEAL put his cover back on. Saluted. Then stepped back into the crowd. Derek Ashford's face had drained of color 15 seconds into that recitation. All the blood just left it, draining down through his feet and into the asphalt. He understood, in that crystalline moment of absolute clarity, that he'd just destroyed a decorated war hero on camera. That every bystander was filming. That the mall's parking lot security cameras had captured the entire sequence. That his strategic competence, his carefully maintained authority, his power, it was all about to evaporate like rain on hot concrete. But that wasn't even the worst part. Marcus Webb stepped out from the mall's east entrance, moving with the unhurried precision of a man who'd been waiting for this exact moment. He was the IT veteran who moonlighted running the surveillance system, Navy veteran himself, a CB from his time in service, and he was holding a portable hard drive like it was a detonation device. Every frame, Marcus said, addressing the general directly, ignoring Ashford completely. Every single frame from 3:06 p.m. when this employee saved your son's life. I have the badge tampering. I have the credential lockouts. I have the calls to the licensing board. I have the security chief terminating a Medal of Honor candidate for performing an emergency life-saving procedure. Marcus held the drive up. State licensing board has copies. Police department has copies. I uploaded it to their secure server at 4:13 p.m. It's already in their hands. Ashford tried to move. Tried to walk back toward the mall doors. His feet didn't cooperate. His mind was already somewhere else, already seeing the end, already calculating the damage, already knowing that his cousin at the licensing board would distance himself, that the mall corporate office would throw him overboard faster than he could generate a defense, that 18 months of vendor fee skimming was about to become prosecutable once someone competent reviewed his falsified incident reports. The paramedics pulled away from the curb, lights flashing, sirens wailing, carrying Lieutenant Morrison to Oak Creek Memorial with Katie's calm intervention already documented on his chart, already listed as the intervention that saved his life. The general watched the ambulance leave. Then he turned to Katie. Actually looked at her, really looked, seeing the limp, seeing the way her left shoulder carried tension, seeing the faded patch visible now that her jacket was no longer buttoned, seeing the calm in her face that came from having already survived the worst thing that could happen and lived to train others on how to do the same. Major Morrison. His voice was formal. Respectful. The voice of a commander addressing someone of equivalent rank. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to. Katie's voice hadn't changed. Still quiet. Still measured. He was my son's commanding officer. I did my job. No. The general stepped closer. You did more than that. You did something sacred. And then someone destroyed you for it. He looked at Ashford, still frozen 30 feet away. That change is effective immediately. 6 months later, Katie Morrison stood in her office at Duval County Emergency Services Headquarters, floor 17, windows overlooking downtown Jacksonville, the morning light streaming across her desk in slats of gold and shadow. Her title placard read, Major Catherine Morrison, retired, Director of Emergency Medical Operations. The faded 75th Ranger Regiment patch was no longer sewn into her jacket lining, it hung in a shadow box on the wall beside her Silver Star citation, the fabric worn and honored, visible to anyone who entered, no longer hidden. The criminal investigation into Derek Ashford took for months. The vendor fee skimming, 18 months of small, careful theft from mall vendors, became prosecutable the moment someone competent reviewed his incident reports against Katie's documentation. The tampering with her credentials during a medical emergency constituted interference with emergency medical operations. His cousin at the licensing board recused himself and retired early. The mall's corporate office issued a formal apology and a settlement that Katie donated entirely to a Marjah Memorial Scholarship Fund for service members in transition. Ashford took a plea deal. No jail time. Restitution. Probation. And a permanent revocation of his security management license. Last Katie heard, he was selling cut-rate insurance policies from a folding table outside a dying strip mall on Jacksonville's east side, his business cards cheap stock, his clientele sparse. The kind of job where nobody asked about your background, where nobody knew who you were, where you earned minimum wage and learned the specific pain of invisibility. Michael visited her office once a month, always in uniform, always with gratitude that came from knowing exactly what his mother had sacrificed and then sacrificed again in silence. Lieutenant Morrison came too, after he'd recovered fully, a full recovery that doctors said should have been impossible, that Katie's precision with a sterilized pocket knife and steady hands had made inevitable. Katie trained a new generation of emergency responders now, her standards impossibly high because she knew what they might see, what they might have to do, what they might have to become to save someone else's child. Her voice in those training sessions carried authority that couldn't be questioned, couldn't be mimicked, came from a place that only people who'd held lives together in the dark could access. The shadow box caught the afternoon light the way it always did. The Ranger patch. The Silver Star. The citations. All of it finally visible. Finally honored. She didn't talk about Marjah often. When she did, the room went silent with a respect that didn't need explaining, the kind of silence that comes from understanding that you're in the presence of someone who'd done the impossible and then had the grace not to advertise it. On her desk, a framed note in the general's handwriting, "Thank you for saving my son. Thank you for your service. Thank you for continuing to serve. H.M." Katie read it sometimes when the weight of command felt heavy, when the shrapnel near her spine ached with weather changes, when the limp made stairs complicated, when she needed to remember that the scars, visible and invisible, were part of a story that didn't end in hiding. The final words appeared like truth written in light: heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. Katie turned off her office light and headed home, no longer invisible, no longer hiding, finally whole. Hit like if this story got you. And tell me, have you ever been underestimated at work, only to prove them all wrong? I read every comment. Subscribe if you haven't already.